Bismillahi wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi ashabihi ajma'in. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This is a topic, subhanAllah, many of us certainly know that we should be, as Muslims, aiming for Jannah, right? That should be our ultimate goal. But how many of us actually live our daily lives to want it, right? And how many of us actually know about it in details that we actually want to desire it or want to have it in our lives, right? So this is the main reason why I chose this topic. And I remember when I was teaching Making Mu'min last semester, and when I was talking to the boys about Jannah, that is something that I resonate much with. So that's why I decided to bring it to the audience today. Right? So before we start, I want to talk about an authentic hadith narrated on the authority of Abu Huraira, where it's a hadith that's about an incident way before we are created, right? And it's a hadith that many of us may have heard of, but then less people has paid attention to some of the parts mentioned in the narration, right? And so this is a hadith where Abu Huraira reported that Rasulullah ﷺ mentioned that when Allah created paradise and hellfire, well beyond or well before our creation, and he sent Jibril alayhi to paradise, saying that asked Jibril alayhi to look at it, right? To look at paradise and then to see what I've prepared for my believers, right? And then Jibril went and looked at it, and then he came back to Allah, and he said, by your might, no one who hear of it but will enter it, right? And then Allah ordered that Jannah to be surrounded with adversity, challenges, or difficulties, right? And then Allah again asked Jibreel alayhi salam to go and look at paradise. And then Jibreel alayhi salam, when he went and looked at paradise, he said, by your might, I fear that whoever have to go through those adversities and trials will not be able to enter paradise, right? And the narration continues with hellfire, right? But then I want to pause it at this moment, because essentially when Allah mentioned to Jibreel, or Jibreel himself mentioned, right? When he mentioned that when he first saw paradise, no one who hear of it but will want to enter it, but will actually enter it, not even desire to enter it, but will actually enter it, right? And so this is where we as Muslims should often reflect or remind ourselves on the unseen, right? And I remember I was talking to a brother a few years ago, but the very conversation or the very practice he has is stuck to my mind till this very day, right? And mashallah, may Allah protect him and preserve him. And I remember I was on a train ride with him, and then he mentioned that because he was going through some tough times, right? At that time he was going through some tough times. And then he told me something really profound. He said whenever he's going through tough times like this, he will actually immediately watch a lecture on the Day of Judgment, right? And subhanAllah, that leaves me drunk dead. Because when you think about it, whatever we're going through in life, how is that ever comparable to what we will be coming across? Every single human beings, whether you're a believer or not, the trial and the greatness of the Day of Judgment, right? It's also part of the unseen, and it's essentially the process where we need to go through before we enter paradise, right? But usually when scholars talk about paradise, they usually start off with reaching there, right? But then I want to tweak the sequence a little bit, where I want to actually mention what is in paradise first, and then I will followed it by the moment you reach the gate, right? And so before we start off talking about paradise, I want to give a disclaimer where Allah gave us, right? Where Allah gave us. Where He mentioned on the authority, where Allah mentioned in a Hadith Qudsi, where I have prepared for my slaves what no eyes has ever seen, and no ears has ever heard, and no hearts has ever comprehended. And again, pause for a moment. Like all those descriptions that Prophet Muhammad has given us about paradise is something only in similitude or in similar in names with the dunya, but never in quality nor in quantity. Right? This is a mindset I want you to frame before I start talking about paradise. Because sometimes when we think about the hereafter, and it's actually normal. That's actually why Allah, whenever He talks about paradise or when He talks about the unseen, He will actually give us a parable that we are able to relate to. But always remember, whatever we imagine is never close. It's never near to what is actually prepared for us. Right? Be it in punishment or be it in reward. Right? And so I want to frame also the coming discussion in the format of you being on a vacation. Because all those that's been described in the coming discussion is more of something that Muslims and non-Muslims would spend thousands, if not hundreds, of dollars to go on a vacation to witness what we're about to discuss. Right? So I want you to frame your perspective now to being in a vacation, right? Going on a vacation, on a trip, right? Touring paradise. And before we get into the discussion on the details of paradise, how much more better is paradise, right? Because in a hadith collected in Muslim, where the joys of paradise are actually much more greater than the world. But how much greater? Sa'id ibn Sa'id al-Sa'idi, rahimahullah, narrated that the Prophet Muhammad mentioned that a space the size of a arrow ball in paradise, that amount of space is actually better than whatever is here on earth. I'll repeat. Just a bowl space in paradise, it's much better than everything and anything we have on earth and in paradise and in heaven, heavens and earth, right? And so this is how much more greater is paradise, right? And then I want you to imagine once you step into paradise, you're just staring at things, right? You should be staring at things. You better be staring at things. So the first thing you notice could be the ground you're stepping on, right? The soil you're stepping on. And how would it look like actually? And on the authority of Ahmed al-Tirmidhi, rahimahullah, he mentioned that the Prophet Muhammad mentioned that he asked Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, what are people made of? Right? And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentioned that people are made of water. And then he further on carry on with his question. He asked, then from what is paradise built in? Right? And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentioned that paradise is built of bricks, not with clay, but with gold and silver. Right? And the mortar of fragrant musk. So not only do they look beautiful, they smell beautiful too. SubhanAllah. And not only, and the hadith doesn't end there, right? And the petals, you know, like in dunya, usually by this riverside, you see petals or pebbles, like, and stones, right, on the riverside and all those. You know what are those made of in paradise? Those are essentially made of rubies and pearls. And every of those are in paradise, which are worth millions of dollars, if not billions, in Hong Kong or around the world, right? And imagine all those are just on the floor you're stepping on, right? And the hadith doesn't end there. And the soil is basically saffron. And whoever enters it is blessed with joy and will never be miserable. and he will remain there forever and never die. His clothes will never wear out also, and his youth will never fade away. Right? And the hadiths end there. And I want you to continue on with the journey of staring at things, right? And so the next thing you realize is around the soil there are some rivers that are flowing. Right? And how are those rivers flowing? And in Bukhari, Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu mentioned when he was ascended to Al-Isra'atul Miraj, right? And he was able to witness paradise himself. And he told us to the best of his ability what he'd seen, right? And he mentioned that he once saw a river, and then on the river there are two banks, of which is not made of any land, not with soil, but with hollow pearls. So I want you to imagine like rivers that are flowing through hollow pearls. Those are the banks of the river. Right? Try to imagine it. But again, it's never imaginable. But yeah, it's worth the effort, I guess. But imagine all those movie scenery are trying to depict all those mesmerizing scenery, but yet all those are actually prepared way beyond any human beings in beauty, in smell, or in any aspect of our sensation, right? And then he continued. He asked Jibril alayhi salam, what is that river that is flowing? And then Jibril alayhi salam mentioned, this is actually Al-Kawthar. This is Al-Kawthar, which is prepared for you. Right? And then behold, its scent and its mud, not only does it appear as pearls, but they actually smell like musk. And I was Googling what exactly or how much does musk cost. And then I realized actually a small bottle, 10 milli, a good quality of musk, of course. 10 milligrams of it costs $3,000. And yet again, they're all on the floor. We're still talking about the floors, by the way. Yeah. So they're all on the floors, right? And then I want you to start looking up now. Like after talking about the floors, I want you to start looking up. And then Al-Qutubi, rahimahullah, mentioned there is actually no day and night in paradise, but it is actually a continuous light. And where does this stems from? Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah, actually mentioned that this is a light that stems from the throne of Allah. Because I want you to know that in an authentic hadith narrated, right? Prophet Muhammad mentioned that the ceiling of paradise is actually the throne of Allah. Right? So every blessing, like many of the rivers that we will be talking about, actually stems from the throne of Allah. And even the light which stems from the throne of Allah. Right? And then imagine those bright light are nourishing our nutrients for trees in Jannah. So imagine how big of a size they will be, right? Prophet Muhammad mentioned that the trees in paradise are so great that a rider could ride under its shade for 100 years. For 100 years. It's a hadith narrated or collected in Bukhari. Right? For an almost 100 years, it's the amount of time that it takes the rider to leave the shade of the tree. And imagine its size, right? And not only that, there are different types of tree, and there's a type of tree called Sidra al-Muntaha, which is a tree that is very special, that the leaves looks like elephant shapes, elephant ears, but then its size is enough to cover the entire ummah. That's its size. That's just a leaf, by the way, of the size of the tree. And then the fruits, how big would the fruits be? Are basically, it's like an entire mug size. I'm not sure, have you noticed that there's a trend pretty common in Hong Kong that people starting to, because like Hong Kong being a place of where logistics are pretty convenient and with multicultural or multi-facet of backgrounds of people living together. So there's actually a trend that's been quite common in Hong Kong is that they're starting to purchase fruits from abroad. What do I mean? I mean luxurious fruits from abroad. Remember back then in the uh, Mid-Autumn Festival. So different companies will actually give each other gifts as a celebration and all this sort. And then usually they will be providing each other with luxurious fruits, right? Fruits from Japan, fruits from Korea, fruits from basically all around the world. And subhanAllah, if you get the chance to taste it, you need to taste it. Because then you will realize those are way, way better for a particular genre of fruits, of course. They taste actually way better than what you have. Say, for example, Korean, if I'm not mistaken, they're known for grapes. And you get the chance to try Korean grapes, oh my goodness.
Pakistani mangoes.
And of course, not to forget, Pakistani's mango, of course. Yeah, not to forget. Yeah. And then so those fruits, and they don't cost less. I mean, I remember for 6 pears from Japan can cost you a few $100s. $100. Yeah. So that's the price of a fruit of big tasty fruits, right? And imagine the size of the fruits are not describable in the sense that it's actually as large as a mug in this dunya, right? And of course there are fruits much bigger in size. And imagine how it would taste, right? And how much it would worth in this dunya, right? Monetary value wise, right? And other than that, you started to notice that not only is the leaves of Siratul Muntaha, are they large, and Prophet Muhammad actually described that it's veiled in colors indescribable. So they're not green, but with colors that is indescribable. As a human beings, we actually, how do we notice color is because we can recognize wavelengths, or it's a bit science, yeah. But basically, how do we recognize color? It's because we can basically see light waves in a particular spectrum, right? So that's why we can notice blue, green, red, because they are basically in different so-called wavelengths, right? And when you imagine that Prophet Muhammad said or called that color indescribable, right? It doesn't mean it falls outside of that range, of that wavelength we're accustomed to. Allahu Alam, right? And imagine how beautiful it is that Allah has custom made a color for our sight, right? And then you started also to notice that the trunk of the trees, right? And how do they look like? Prophet Muhammad mentioned in Sahih al-Jami', where he mentioned there is no tree in paradise, any tree, except that its tree trunk is actually made of gold and silver. Right? Imagine, not only are the leaves in beautifully undescribable colors, but even the trunks are in gold. And I want you to picture this. Imagine, usually people spend thousands of dollars to just go visit a place for their natural scenery, for their nature scenery, right? Because of how beautiful it's been described. Imagine all those are just in the peripheral. Like you're seeing all those magnificent moments in paradise where it's way beyond any commercial of resort you've ever seen. And I want you to picture that. How drop dead, or how your jaw dropped, basically, how your jaw dropped from all those sceneries, right? And the next question you might ask, how many of those you're seeing are actually yours, right? Especially in a space like, in a place where Hong Kong, where space are basically limited, right? And the next question you might ask is, how much of those space you're seeing, how much of those sceneries are actually yours for you to enjoy, right? And Prophet Muhammad give us, or actually across all the narrations, that's something I realized, in terms of the size of Jannah, of your Jannah, by the way, I'm not talking about the entire Jannah, but of your Jannah in itself, we've never been given the size of any level other than the lowest one. I'll repeat. In terms of the size of your Jannah or an individual's Jannah, there is never a narration, at least to the best of my knowledge, that speaks of any level other than the lowest one. Where it's in a hadith, where Musa actually asked his Rabb, right, who will have the lowest position in paradise? And Allah mentioned a man who will come after the people of paradise have entered into paradise, the last man to enter paradise, basically. And then he will be asked to enter paradise. And then he will ask his Lord, "Oh my Rabb, how?" The people have already taken their place, right? The people have already taken their place. And then he will be asked, will you not be content if I give you an equivalent of the kingdom on earth? And he said, yes, my Rabb, I will be content, right? And then he was then told, you will be given as much as the kingdom on earth again, and as much again, and as much again, and as much again. And some narration actually mentioned up to 5 times. Up to 5 times, right? And then he will then be mentioned, I'm content with it, my Rabb. Like, I'm content with it. And then he will then be told, you will have all that in 10 times. And that is not the highest level of paradise, but the lowest one. But the lowest one. And then of course that man will actually answer, I'm content with that also again. Right? And then with all those space, and then you realize there's actually a smell that comes out from Jannah that is actually beyond you've ever smelled. Allah mentioned in Surah Waqiyah, there is for him rest and provision. Right? The word for provision is rayhan, which actually means literally sweet smelling plants. Right? And this is actually a term used for symbolizing the complete satisfaction and delight a person feels whenever he smells that smell, right? And then I want you to imagine again, it is actually sunnah to smell good, right? It is actually sunnah to try to smell good, right? You can be applying other, like that brother over there, you can be trying to smell good, and there's actually a reason why. When we are told that Rasulullah SAW enjoy a certain things, and then we are described how much more we are granted with in paradise, because essentially we are developing that appreciation in this dunya. When you think about it, whenever you smell something good, even though it's a short-lived smell, say for example someone who's smelling well on the MTR, you would actually take another sniff, right? You will sniff a second time to look for that smell again, right? But then even no matter how short-lived it is, but you still seek that smell. But imagine, it's not an individual that smells good in paradise, but it's an entire Jannah that smells good, right? And so imagine how it is able to engineer our appreciation in for the akhirah through living the beauty or the sunnah of Rasulullah SAW, right? He likes smelling good, right? And so we as believers should try to smell good. And the more you want to try to smell good, the more you will appreciate the undescribable smell of good in paradise, right? And then from far, you will start to notice there's actually a huge structure. And then you realize that as along you walk in paradise, you realize you're going somewhere. Rasulullah SAW mentioned by the one in whose hand is the soul of Muhammad. Rasulullah SAW is swearing by Allah, right? Any one of the believers will know their home or their dwelling in paradise more familiar than he knows the one in this world. So as along you walk in paradise, you realize you are walking to somewhere you are more familiar with, somewhere you have been or you will be in right? And this is actually your palace. Your palace, right? And so it may sound or it may look new, but certainly not unfamiliar, right? And Allah mentioned in Az-Zumar, but for those who fear Allah and keep their duty to their Rabb, for them are built lofty rooms, one above the other, and under which rivers flows. And this is the promise of Allah. And Allah does not fail in His promise, right? And in Qadir, when he talks about this ayah, he mentioned that Allah has told us that one of His blessing or His blessed slave will have rooms or rooms that are above one another, right? Lofty rooms one another, right? And then well constructed, strong and decorated, right? And how are these palaces described to us? Rasulullah mentioned in Sayyid al-Jami' where in paradise there are dwellings whose inside can be seen from outside. Right? These are, Allah knows best what they are, but then I want you to imagine, again, appreciate true in this dunya, where if you visit any 5 stars hotel, usually there's one common characteristics among them, right? What they are, usually at the lobby entrance, you see high ceilings, but they are also made transparent. And if you've noticed all the skyscrapers around the world, they're actually made with glass, right? They're made with glass because generally speaking, human beings have this craving to see outside, to not be limited by this space, basically. Like, can you imagine, this is a glass that is more transparent than any of those structures those are built outside. Because as a profession, I used to work a lot with architects, and I would say glass are basically the most difficult material to handle because they are not environmentally friendly, so they are just aesthetically good, right? But no matter how much the architects want their buildings to be filled with glass, there are actually certain height of the room that they cannot use glass, right? Or there are certain space they can't use glass, right? But imagine this is a palace that is entirely hollow, where the inhabitants in that palace can actually see the outside, right? And it doesn't end there. And Allah mentioned that these are palaces for those who actually feed the hunger and speak softly and gently and fast continuously and pray at night while people are asleep. These are who the palace belongs to, right? All those good deeds, all those actions are basically prepared, or the palace itself is prepared for those who perform those good deeds, right? And how tall are they, right? The question you may ask next. How tall are these palaces? So in Sahih Bukhari, Prophet Muhammad mentioned the tents, hollow out pearls, where you can see from the inside out. How big are they? They are 30 miles in height. And in each corner you will have a family there. And I want you to pause for a moment. How tall is 30 miles? I don't know. I actually, because in Hong Kong we actually use metrics scale, right? And how tall are they? I'll give you a brief, rough idea. I did the maths actually earlier, 10 minutes ago, to make sure I can help you visualize how tall are they, right? You know, Burj Khalifa is 830 meters in height. From the bottom to the tip, right? 830 miles, right? That's nearly 1 kilometer. And 30 miles is actually 58 of those Burj Khalifa. 58 of those Burj Khalifa. I don't know, I've never actually been to Dubai to witness how tall it is. But then some of the buildings some of the tallest buildings in Hong Kong are actually close to that height. Say, for example, ICC. And imagine, if you were to put it in perspective, the height of ICC multiplied by 60 times. Right? Imagine the ceiling or the number of rooms you have in paradise. Right? And that's the height. And in terms of the width, some narration actually mentioned it's 60 miles. Right?
30 miles this way.
30 miles in height,
60 miles.
60 miles in width. Right? And those are the size of the palaces. Imagine if you were to work in this dunya for that amount of space. It's literally an island. It can be considered an island, to be honest, with today's space consideration, right? Restraints, right? And how do you earn those paradise or earn those palaces in paradise, right? And Ahmad reported in Sahih Hadith, Ibn Abbas reported that Rasulullah SAW mentioned, whoever builds a masjid for Allah, even if it is as small as a nestling place stretched out by the same grouse for its eggs. Pause for a moment. This is actually a narration that's Sahih, and out of the many narrations that many of us may have heard of in terms of building a mosque for Allah, this is something that I find the most details in, right? And then it mentioned, even if it is just as small as a space for an egg, Allah will build for you a paradise. It's actually a Sahih Hadith mentioned again in Sahih al-Jamiyah, right? And just that amount of space, Allah will build for you for an entire paradise. SubhanAllah, I was on Valley Ranch Masjid website, and then something I noticed really innovative from them is that they have this project called Sponsor a Prayer Place. Sponsor a Prayer Place. I'm not sure is it around in different masjid, but then I find this really, really profound or really encouraging. When a person who sponsor a prayer place, whoever prays on that prayer place, it is in your account. It is in your account. So imagine for a person who purchased the front rows, then till the very day the masjid is there, for every person who prays in the front row, let alone the row of the imam, right? Who prays in the front row, it will be in your account. And how much reward is that? And every single time, and when you think about it, for every masjid, every single time you sponsor an egg space of a prayer place, though nobody is an egg size to be praying in it, Allah will build for you an entire palace in paradise. Right? And another way to earn this paradise is by just simply praying the 12 rakahs of sunnah we have daily. Rasulullah mentioned, collected in Muslim and Abu Dawud and Ahmad, where Rasulullah mentioned, whoever prays 12 rakahs of super obligatory prayers, Allah will build for him a house in paradise. And that's basically 2 sunnah before Fajr, 4 before Zuhr, 2 after Zuhr, and 2 after Maghrib and 2 after Isha, right? And some narration actually mentioned that Rasulullah SAW, no matter whether he's traveling or not, there are actually some of these sunnah prayer where he won't give up. And that is actually 2 before Fajr and 4 before Zuhr. And so we as believers should try to keep this a practice for our everyday life, to earn that paradise, right? To earn that paradise. And then with all those space, something you realize, you started to realize that there's something missing, right?
Trees.
Sorry?
Trees.
Trees not in your home, hopefully.
In Jannah, the space.
And space?
The trees in Jannah.
The trees in Jannah? We talked about it, right?
So how do we get trees in Jannah?
How do we get trees in Jannah? Oh, okay. So basically, Rasulullah SAW mentioned in an authentic hadith where whoever says Subhanallah Alhamdulillah, Allahu Akbar, La ilaha illallah, a tree is planted for you in paradise. For one. And those are trees, again, described in those sizes, right? Those are not just an empty mountain where you just have a tiny tree, a tiny plant that's planted. But it's an entire tree of those sizes just planted. Right? And so those are practices where we can earn or start growing our garden in paradise. Right? And then coming back to the thing that's missing, with all those spaces you realize as social animals, there's something needed for us to be completely or even more happy, right? And that would be a person to be with, right? And in Surah Waqiyah, Allah mentioned, we have created the companions of special creation. So they have been specially molded again and made pure and virgin, right? Beloved by nature and equal in age. And that is your companion in paradise. And before sisters start flipping the table, right? That creation Allah speaks of actually is your wife in Jannah, right? And brothers, don't be complaining, I'm sorry, but yes, there will be a wife for you in paradise for eternity, right? But don't worry. She will inshallah be some of the most beloved person for you in the akhirah, right? Because some scholars, when they explain about this ayah, that when the moment you step in paradise, the moment you see your wife who has been sculpted again in paradise, you will actually stand there not moving for an entire 40 years, just staring at her beauty, right? And of course, it goes both way as well. Like your wife will also be staring at your husband's very beauty for at least 40 years, right? And that's how beautiful, how Allah has scolded you guys again for that very meeting of yours, right?
And then when you go out and come back, you become more beautiful as well.
I'll come to that hadith soon, inshallah. And it doesn't end there, right? And how beautiful are the people in paradise? Anas ibn Malik rahimahullah mentioned that Rasulullah sallallahu mentioned in a hadith collected in Bukhari, if one of the women in Jannah would just to be appear in this world, the entire distance of the heavens and the earth will be illuminated with light. And her scent will cover the entire distance, right? And the scarf that she's wearing would in itself better than everything in the world and everything in it. Pause for a moment. Again, heavens and earth, we all often hear this description in the Quran and Sunnah, right? But how big are they? How big is the heavens and earth, right? Because we know there are 7 skies, Allah mentioned in the Quran. And how big are they, I mean, in quantity or in space, right? Actually, in Surah I forgot which surah, when scholars explain that surah, right, they mention that the lowest heaven is basically decorated with stars. So that means everything you see in the sky, or everything that the universe, or anything that the scientists have explored about the universe, those are actually in the lowest level of heaven. Right? So the entire galaxy or the entire universe we're talking about are all just in the first level. And the second level, Prophet Muhammad described to us, the first level, the entire universe is like a ring in a desert. Compared to the third level, the second level is like a ring in a desert. The fourth level compared to the third is like another ring in a desert. Up till the seventh. And up till the seventh heaven. Right? I want you to imagine or appreciate that this entire space would be lit up not by any sun, but by just one person. How beautiful, how beautiful she must have been, right? Sorry?
You're talking about the wife, yes.
Yeah.
I lost the track there.
In this dunya also, inshallah. In this dunya also, inshallah. Right?
Well, we do make the dua, right? Make her the coolness of our eyes.
Yeah, true. And then the next thing you were realizing is that there's a craving in you to eat, right? In paradise, scholars actually make it a point of discussion on why do people eat in paradise, right? Scholars actually discuss this, right? Al-Qurtubi rahimahullah actually mentioned the people of Jannah actually doesn't need to eat, and they don't need to relieve themselves, right? They don't have any pain or hunger, and they don't need to drink to quench their thirst, right? And why do they eat or drink? It's just because for the pure sake of pleasure, right? And he says, to look at the two words that Allah mentioned, the Adam and Jannah, right? There is therein for you not to go hungry nor to go naked. So basically, what is in paradise? What is in paradise? It's enough for you, not for you to go hungry nor for you to go naked, right? Everything is sufficient for you, right? And you don't need any of those, right? And so why do you need to eat? Just for the sake of pleasure, just for the sake of enjoying, right? And so how will you be served? And Surah Al-Fatir, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned, for them therein is fruit, and for whatever they request. So not only do you have fruits given to you, but actually you have whatever you desire, right? And the fruits, by the way, we're talking about here, is completely different from those on earth. In Surah Baqarah, Allah mentioned every time when they're fed with the fruits, and they will actually say, when they realize or when they see the fruit, they say, isn't this the fruit we've had in this dunya? Right? And then once they take a bite, they realize it's completely different. And the most amazing part is when you take your second bite. When you take your second bite, it tastes different again. SubhanAllah. When you think about it, some people might have this mentality where for eternity you will be in paradise, right? You know this. And wouldn't you get bored? Right? Won't you be fed up with things? Right? But then Allah know our nature very well, so much so that even in the food we eat will be different every single time. And not in every single plate, but in every single bite. Yeah, subhanAllah. Right? And there's actually a very funny narration between Rasulullah ﷺ and Omaru Nimaga, right? Rasulullah ﷺ mentioned, he was asked about the rivers of Al-Kawthar, and then he said, he was Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, because he'd been in paradise, right? And then he said, it is a river that Allah has given to me, and it is whiter than milk, sweeter than honey, and there are some birds that drinks from it, and their necks are like, their sizes are basically with their necks the size of a camel. That's how big they are. Like a camel size, right? Their necks are basically the size of the birds in paradise, right? And Umar ibn Khattab, upon hearing this, and he said, they must be having a lot of fun. Because with that size, they must be flying around, enjoying themselves, right? And Rasulullah ﷺ replied, the one who eat them will even have more fun. Okay? So in understanding this hadith, some scholars actually mentioned, the moment you see a flying bird, next moment, it's on your plate.
Barbecue.
It's barbecued, perfectly cooked to the percentage you like, right? 50%, 60%, right? Perfectly in your desire, right? And so Allah also mentioned in Surah Waqiyah, and the flesh of the birds and anything that they may desire. So it's not only limited to fruits and birds, but it's actually anything and everything you desire, basically. Right?
And you will desire something good, pure,
Inshallah.
as you're in Jannah.
Yeah, inshallah. And then the food you eat will actually come out not as excretion. And all those eating, you must be wondering, you must be going out to a lot of toilets, right? Right? But then in the Quran and Sunnah, we're told that the food you eat will actually come out as musk. It will actually be discharged from your body in the form of musk, good smelling musk, right? And so there's no expression or no need or no desire for any toilet, right? And then what are the drinks you will have, right? Allah mentioned in Surah Al-Safat where round or glasses will be passed to them in cups, right? Flowing fountain, crystal white, of a taste delicious to those who drink it, right? Neither will they have any hurt or pain or sin, nor will they have any intoxication from there. So what is Allah describing? It's actually the wine in paradise. And scholars, if I'm not mistaken, it's Ibn Qayyim rahimahullah. He mentioned about, so when you drink wine in this dunya, it usually comes with side effects, right? The side effects for intoxication, vomiting, or that discomfort that comes with it, right? All those smell, hangover, and all those discomfort that comes with it. But in paradise, all those are removed from it. And not only that, you're given with the best wine you can ever be served, way beyond anything in this dunya, right? And so scholars mention that why would you trade yourself for the wine in this dunya against the wine in the paradise, right? Because Rasul mentioned in an authentic narration where, of course, this applies to whoever don't repent. Whoever drinks the wine in this dunya will not taste the wine in paradise. Right? And so we as believers should try to refrain from drinking wine. And many people are actually unaware of the severity, and also there are some narrations that not only does it strictly prohibit you from drinking, but it actually prohibits you to be even sitting in the same table where alcohol is served. Right? I'm not sure, I forgot which book of hadith it's collected, but I remember it's considered sahih, right? And Prophet Muhammad said, he who believes in the last day should prevent from sitting on the same table where alcohol is served. Because this is a narration that why I decided to bring it up is because a few years ago, actually, a colleague of mine asked me a question. And he asked me, wait, do Muslims drink also? And I said, no, we don't drink. We don't drink at all. And then he said, oh darn it, you must be missing out on a lot of fun. Then how would you be enjoying yourself in dinner tables where the usual drink or enjoyment on a dinner table is basically the alcoholic beverages that's being served, right? And so this leaves me with...
How about the narration?
Okay.
Whoever believes in Allah in the last day, let him not sit at a table where wine is being drunk. Imam Ahmad.
Oh, so basically it's an hadith collected by Imam Ahmad, where whoever believes in Allah in the last day should not sit on the table where alcohol is being drank, right? And yeah, so this is a narration where many people are unaware of because the severity of it comes with the influence. Because in the Sharia, whenever Allah prohibits us from drinking or from a certain act, usually the steps that would lead to it are also prohibited, right? Including, like, say for example, zina and all those any other acts of evil, where Allah will actually close the door for us from coming close to it. Because when you think about it, when you're sitting on a dinner table, when peer influence is basically rampant high, how likely will you be able to restrain from drinking or from falling in from all those temptations, right? And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, out of His knowledge, out of His wisdom, prohibited us out of His mercy, also prohibited us from just sitting on the same table where alcohol is served. But again, this hadith needs to be taken care of in many levels, because especially for reverts, where they usually live in a family with non-Muslim. So this is again a hadith where it needs to be taken in consideration in terms of context, in terms of situation also. Yeah. And some of the other drinks you will have in paradise, of course, definitely not limited to, are basically al-kawthar, purified water, honey, milk, and wine. Right? All those are basically in different types of rivers that flow in paradise.
No soft drinks.
Soft drinks. I'm not sure, is it considered pure to begin with? Yeah, so I'm not sure whether you will have any Coca-Cola, Fantas, Diet Cokes, right? If you need any in paradise. Sorry?
Pure version of those.
Yeah, pure version of those, inshallah. Right. Inshallah. And then the next moment you realize is, how would you be as a person in paradise, right? And there are many narrations that speaks of how we'll become as a person in paradise. And say, for example, from the clothes we wear, where actually in an authentic hadith, where one of the trees in paradise will actually give out the clothes you wear, right? It's not woven, but it's actually grown out from a tree. So every tree will have like a seed. I don't know how to put it, but like a cocoon kind of stuff that would actually encompass the clothes that you want to wear. And whenever you desire that clothes, it will come down in your service. You know? And then as mentioned before, there will be no toilet or excretion. And then your beauty, by the way, your beauty is also something worth mentioning. Because in an authentic narration where your beauty will actually be as beautiful as Yusuf alayhi salam. Right? In another narration, how beautiful is Yusuf alayhi salam? Allah's messenger Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentioned that the beauty of Yusuf alayhi salam is basically given half of that the entire world. So no matter how beautiful you think you are, you're just one part of the many beauty that Yusuf alayhi salam, he himself, one person, encompassed. Right? And inshallah, we all will become like Yusuf alayhi salam in paradise. Right? Every single one of us. And by the way, your height, some people might be bothered by it, right? Your height will basically be the height of Adam alayhi salam, right? Which means, I'm not sure how tall he is in some of the narration, right? But then he's basically considered a giant in our times, right? And we will also have the strength of 1,000 men. And men will know what I am meaning here, right? And so in terms of keeping yourself ready,
60 cubits.
yes, 60 cubit tall. But how tall is that in metrics, right? I don't know. So in terms of, now you seem like all ready to be meeting people, right? With all those attributes, all those heights, all those beauty, all those clothes. You feel like meeting people, right? And so in Jannah, actually, it's not only by yourself. With all those spaces, it's not only by yourself, right? Allah mentioned, before we socialize, right, there's an aspect where Allah mentioned in Surah Al-Hijr, where we shall remove from their hearts any sense of injury, or they will be brothers joyfully facing each other on thrones of dignity. Right? So any ill feelings that you have for one another be completely gone. That includes with your spouse, by the way. Right? Includes your spouse, right? And then so yeah, and then so basically every ill feelings from one another, for one another, will be removed in paradise. Right? And so there's a place in paradise where Muslims would gather every Friday. Right? In an authentic hadith narrated in Muslim, in paradise there's a street to which everyone would come out every Friday to that particular street, right? The north wind will blow and would gather fragrance on their faces and their clothes, right? and they will find their beauty and their loveliness increased, right? And they imagine having been to that street with the fragrance that's blown under your face after meeting friends, after meeting prophets, after meeting companions. You come back to your wife, and then you started noticing something different between you guys. You realize you guys each other have become more beautiful, right? From that wind that blows. And so, by Allah, you will be mentioning by Allah, you will increase in beauty and loveliness after leaving us, right? And they would say, and they would reply, by Allah, you have also increased in beauty and loveliness after leaving us. And so, with time, paradise just gets better. And even in the way you look to each other, right? And in terms of worship, some of the things you do, there's no worship in general in paradise, but then there are something that we will do inherently from our heart. And guess what it is? Rasulullah mentioned in Bukhari, actually, we would actually praise Allah in the morning and the evening. Where the only words of worship that will ever come out from our mouth is Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah. Right? And some of the other things you will be doing is basically, in Bukhari, the Prophet Muhammad mentioned where a Bedouin actually came to him and he said, one of the inhabitants of paradise will ask Allah to allow him to cultivate the land. So a person because during the times of Rasulullah there are many farmers or Bedouins who worked as farmers, as profession, right? And if you talk to any farmers, some of the most joyous moments in their life is basically when they harvest, right? And Rasulullah mentioned to this Bedouin that the inhabitants of paradise will have some where Allah has granted him to cultivate the land. And Allah will ask him, are you not living in pleasure you like? Like with all those enjoyment, with all those ease and comfort? Are you not enjoying yourself? And then he will actually reply, yes, right? I'm happy, I'm content, but I like to cultivate lands. Right? That's just part of my nature, this is something I enjoy. And then when the man is allowed to sow seeds, the plants will actually grow up and get ripe in need immediately and ready for reaping, and so on and so forth until he has a mountain size in a blink of an eye. Right? When you think about it, sometimes when you, in this dunya, the most rewarding moments in your life is basically the effort you put in actually makes out to be a reward for you, right? And in paradise, all those will actually happen in a matter of seconds, right? And imagine how fun would it be for that farmer, right? And then Allah will continue saying to him, O son of Adam, take here you are and gather the yield, right? And subhanahu wa ta'ala will mention nothing satisfied you. And right, and that Bedouin will say that man must be from the Quraysh, or it must be from amongst the farmers, basically. Right? And Rasulullah smiled when he talked about it. And that's actually what the Bedouin said. He was surprised that anyone would want to farm in paradise. Right, Rasulullah. And after all those enjoyment, pleasure in paradise, there's something missing. There's something missing, right? And scholars actually mention this is something that is beyond anything and everything we've experienced so far. But we mentioned all those scenery, all those palaces, all those meetings, all those gatherings, all that is or uncomparable to that very biggest blessing that you will get to come across in paradise. It's a hadith narrated or collected in Muslim, where a caller will call out, O dwellers of paradise, and we would actually respond, at your service and pleasure, our Lord. Right? The good is in your hand, And He subhanahu wa ta'ala will mention, are you well pleased now? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, out of His mercy, out of His glory, asks the inhabitants of paradise, are you well pleased now? Right? And they would say, why should we not be pleased? Right? Why should we not be pleased when you have basically given us paradise, not to any other creation? Right? And He would, however, say, may I not give you something even more excellent than that? And we would ask our Lord, what could even be more excellent than that? Right? What could even be more excellent than what you've given us? And He subhanahu wa ta'ala will mention, I shall cause my pleasure to descend upon you, and I shall never be disturbed or annoyed afterwards. So that moment is basically the moment where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala acknowledge how, no matter how flawed our acts of worship, no matter how incomplete, how filled with sins we are as human beings, Allah will actually mention He is pleased with us. And that's actually everything and anything we need. And subhanAllah, Allah mentioned in Surah Al-Fajr, Surah Al-Fajr, where in the last two ayahs, where Allah mentioned, we are people that are pleasing to Allah and are well pleased to Allah. Right? And we will be told to enter paradise in groups, for where we will inherit or stay therein for eternity. Right? So as believers, we're actually waiting or living for that very moment of acknowledgement from Allah, where His rida, where His pleasure is confirmed on us, no matter how flawed or how incomplete we are. And in another narration, it doesn't stop there. Right? Rasulullah SAW mentioned in another hadith in Muslim, where when we are dwelling in paradise, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would ask us, do you wish me to give you anything more? So every Friday we'll be gathered, and in one day we will be called to a place different from where we've gathered. Right? A caller will call out, calling us to a place. Right? And then Allah will gather us there and then ask us, do you wish me to give you anything more? And then we would say to Allah, where, oh Allah, you have brightened our face, you have made us enter paradise, and most importantly, you've saved us already from hellfire. Right? There's nothing else we can ask for. There's nothing more we can ask for. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when you think about all those narrations, are basically when our humanly desire are completely satisfied, where we can't think of anything more to ask of, but yet Allah Himself, out of His glory, out of His mercy, is offering us more than that. Right? And then He mentioned, Allah will basically lift the veil from His face. Allah will lift the hijab from His face. And then, at that very instant, there is nothing more beloved to the dwellers of paradise than that very moment of seeing Allah. And another narration, Prophet also mentioned, in a night where it's a full moon, he was walking with the Sahabas, and then he was pointing to a full moon, and he said, you shall see your Lord just as you shall see this full moon. Right? So as believers, we should aim for not only paradise, because paradise is certainly something that comes with effort, but it's not the highest goal out there. As believers, our highest goal is actually the pleasure of Allah. That in itself is an intention that is beyond the reward and the punishment system that scholars mentioned as a motivation to believers. Right? Those are essentials to be there, because as human beings we're motivated by some of our humanly desire. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, out of His wisdom, knowledge, and certainly acknowledge that. Right? But then beyond that, beyond all those desires that we have for the akhirah, there's actually something that's way beyond noble. right? And that is actually for the pleasure of Allah. And that we as believers should live our life aiming to please Allah, because then we will better appreciate the acceptance from Allah. Right? And so all those will be happening on every Jummah, right? Every Jummah or every Friday we will be seeing Allah, meeting companions. Right? And something you will notice is that after all this you have been given, the next moment you realize is, how long will I have to stay in paradise? And essentially, what Shaitan did to trick Adam alayhi salam from paradise is basically tricking him into believing that after having that forbidden fruit, he will be able to stay in paradise forever, for eternity, right? That's actually the trick Shaitan used to trick our father, Adam alayhi salam, out of paradise. So this must be a question that every believer should be asking, right? And in a hadith collected in Bukhari and Muslim, Sayyid al-Khudri, rahimahullah, mentioned that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentioned that death will be brought in the form of a ram. Death will be brought in the form of a ram in between paradise and hellfire. And what happened next? And the caller will call out, "O people of paradise," and then they will crane their neck and look, and they will say, and they will be asked, "Do you recognize this?" And they will say, "Yes." This is basically death in the form of a ram, right? And all of them will have seen it. Everyone, big, small, no matter where you are in paradise, you will see it clearly, right? And then the caller will again call out, this time not to the people of paradise, but to the people of hellfire, right? And they will crane their neck and look again, and they will be asked, "Do you recognize this?" And they will say, "Yes." The people of hellfire will also recognize that that ram is basically death, right? And so they will look at it and they will have seen it again completely, entirely, basically. Then the ram at that very instant will be slaughtered. That ram will be slaughtered. So basically death will be slaughtered. And the caller will call out to both the paradise, to the people of paradise and to the people of hellfire, that it is for eternal, where there will be no death. Aisha radiallahu anha, when upon hearing this narration, she mentioned, if there was any people that would ever cry to death, that would be that moment. Because when you think about it, all those we have described there, sometimes I realize it's actually a certain level of injustice to be talking about paradise without talking about hellfire. Because when you ask any people, sometimes it's just the free from worry, free from concern, free from ill feelings, that in itself can actually make your day. I remember I was watching this TV channel where it's interviewing kids, like, what is your happiest, what makes you happy, basically, right? And some of the kids actually reply that it's when they're free from something that makes them unhappy. Child as simple as 7, 8 years old have basically made up the philosophy of life, right? Where anything that makes them unhappy is out of the window, that in itself is happiness. When you think about it, all those we have described, it's part of Allah's perfection. Where I remember a scholar mentioned something really profound, where he mentioned that Allah is both perfect in His reward and perfect in His punishment. To be just free from hellfire alone is in itself more than sufficient. Even if you don't get to paradise, right? Because I'll give you a glimpse of how scary hellfire is. In an authentic hadith where Rasulullah mentioned that a person's molar teeth will be the size of Mount Uhud in hellfire. A person's molar teeth will be the size of Mount Uhud in hellfire. So basically, what does that mean? It's basically that person will be enlarged in size. And what does that mean? You know, when we talk about, I remember I was doing this first aid first aid course from my company, and then we were talking about the level of burnt, right? So clinically speaking, there are different definitions of degree of burnt, right? And you know, just burning a few millimeters from our skin is enough for you to be considered severely burnt, right? And that few millimeters of skin is enough to cause us excruciating pain, right? And imagine in hellfire, not only is it way much more hotter than it is in paradise, but in fact, our skins are also grown in extra size with extra sensation as sensors to feel that pain. Imagine how thick of your skin will be in hellfire when one is basically the size, with this molder the size of Mount Hood, right? You're free from all those punishments, right? Subhanallah, I haven't even talked about the next part.
Do you want to part two?
No. But there's something I also want to mention. After knowing all those about paradise, I want you to imagine the moment you reach the gates of paradise. I'll make this the end, inshallah. I'll make this the end. So basically, the moment you reach the gates of paradise, right? Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam mentioned that the entire day of judgment will be 50,000 years in length, right? And to put you in perspective, though it's certainly nowhere near, I remember with all those protests going on, sometimes when you're walking down the streets, you might come across the front line between protesters and riot police, right? And I remember one time after a talk from Wancha Masjid, and a few brothers of us are basically trying to figure our way out, right? Because Wancha area is basically some of the most critical areas, I would say. And then at that time, many of us are basically stuck in the masjid with tear gas firing out, right? And then at that time, or when you even watch live, right? And then we were basically running across the barrier between, or basically the front lines, right? We were running across, like, frantically. We were scared, we were nervous of being shot at, right? All those nervousness creeps in, right? When you think about it, on a day of judgment, because at that time we were also still caring for one another, right? As brothers, we were trying to check out on one another that we're still running, we're still making our fast pass through that dangerous zone, right? We're checking on one another. But imagine on a day of judgment, it's a day where a mother would want to sacrifice its kids. A mother would want to sacrifice its kids. That's how grave, how grief, or how gravely scary day it is. I don't know how to put it in words. But then imagine it's a day where parents would forsake their child. Brothers would forsake their sisters. Fathers would forsake their daughters. Right? Would want to ramp them up, or to want to ransom them, to bail them out. Right? It's a day that's severe. And passing through all those days, passing through all the mizan, all the waiting, all the questioning, and in the last moment, you will pass through that sirat that is as sharp as a sword and as thin as a hair, that is levitating above hellfire, and witnessing all those people dropping there, and you finally make it to the gates of paradise. And with time, you start to slowly see people gathering up in front of the gates of paradise, right? And you're just waiting for that one moment, right? And some of the narration mentioned Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, we will be going to different prophets to ask them to open the door. Right? Imagine all those horrific sceneries that go in behind us. We just want the doors to be open. We just want to be there in paradise. Right? We're just waiting for that one moment. And we went to Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And that's who, he was the only prophet who cared about us. And he's the one who will actually hold the ring. Some of the narration mentioned he will hold the ring of the gate of paradise. And he will be knocking on it. And that very moment, an angel will appear. An angel will appear. And he said, and he will ask, who are you? Right? And Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam mentioned, I'm Muhammad. Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Right? And the angel will then reply, I've been told to not open this gate other than for Muhammad. Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Right? Imagine, he is the Sayyid of humanity. Right? And how great of an honor to be following him. How great of an honor to be following him as a prophet. Right? And all of us, narrations mentioned, will be led in groups through the gates of paradise. And pause for a second. When we talk about gates of paradise, it's not the door of MCH. It's not the size of the door of MCH, right? We're talking about, in some narration mentioned, a rider would take 40 years to ride from one gate, from one part or one side of the gate to the other side of the gate. That is the width of one gate in paradise. And we're told there are entirely 8 gates in paradise. And each gate corresponds to a particular good deed. Right? Some gates are called the gates of fasting, and some doors are called the gates of salah, and some doors are called basically the form of charity, right? And so different doors will have a certain attributes. But how does that affect us, right? Rasulullah also mentioned whoever performs that good deeds well enough will be called from that particular gate. So if you have been fasting the Ramadan and also your Sunnah fast well enough, you will be called from the door of Rayhan, the door of fasting. Right? If you paid enough charity, right, more than of course what is obligated on you, you will be called from the door of charity. Right? And Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, when upon hearing this hadith, he said, will there be anyone that's been called through the entire 8 gates? And Abu Bakr, because if you think about it, Abu Bakr is basically considered the forefront or the forerunner in terms of good deeds. Where Umar ibn Khattab actually gave up completely from fighting, from reaching his rank. Right? And so that moment, upon hearing all those 8 gates, the first thing that comes to his mind is basically be the one to be called through the 8 gates. And what did Rasulullah reply? Yes, a person can be called through the 8 gates of paradise, and I pray to Allah that you will be one of them. Right? So that's the end of the narration, and this is just to give you a picture of how it looks like to finally reach the gates of paradise, because we are yet to reach there. It's still a long way in our lives, inshallah, to earn paradise. Right? And may Allah make us amongst those who inherit paradise. And subhanAllah, when scholars mention why Allah used the terminology of inheritance in the Quran, say for example in Surah Mu'minun, where we are told those who perform all those acts of good will inherit paradise. Right? And scholars mentioned, what does it mean to be inheriting paradise? It basically means, it is basically an injustice, of course from Allah's point of view, to not give a believer of those things they deserve. Even though we never do, by the way. Even though we never do. And Allah is mentioning inheriting paradise is because He Himself, subhanahu wa ta'ala, out of His glory, out of His mercy, thinks we deserve it. But we never do. And I'll call for an end because I better catch my last train before,
1.5 hours.
inshallah. So, any questions?
There's one that.
Easy question,
Yeah,
please.
on the balance sense. So there's people who say that, for Muslims, we have to work for Jannah.
Mm.
So does that mean that Muslims are not guaranteed Jannah? Are Muslims guaranteed Jannah?
So the brother asked, so in terms of dawah perspective, some of the other faiths basically claim that believing in itself is enough to reach their definition of eternity, goodness, right? Whether it's called paradise or not, right? And how about as believers, like as Muslims, how do we view the concept of paradise, whether it is for all those who believe in Allah, right? And there's a different perspective we can answer this question. But the most important part is, out of all those discussions in paradise, we are told that there is this key where we, as believers, every single one of us should have. And what is that key? Is La ilaha illallah. And some of the narration that considered authentic, where it's a really long narration, where it happens on the Day of Judgment, right? And the one who's narrating the hadith the one who narrated the hadith on his deathbed, does he or did he narrated that hadith to others? Because he feared that if this hadith were to be known by others, people will give up trying. And what is the hadith? That's a hadith where Rasulullah mentioned that on the Day of Judgment, where Rasulullah will prostrate in front of Allah and ask Him to free His ummah. And every single prostration, Allah will free some of His slaves. And until the very end of the narration, actually back and forth, Rasulullah asked or prostrated and asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for freeing us. Right? And the very end of the narration, cut it short, the very end of the narration, it speaks of Allah in the end promised Rasulullah that He will free whoever has an atom weight of faith. Right? But though this is not to be taken lightly, because for paradise to be deserving on us, there's a certain requirement we also need to fulfill in terms of action, right? And so that would mean being eventually in paradise. Being eventually in paradise, but not immediately there. Right? So some of the Muslims, believers, may face purification in hellfire, right? Though they will eventually enter paradise. Because one thing we need to note is that out of all the discussions we have, paradise is perfect. Paradise is pure. And so it can only be those who are pure, right? And for us to be purified for Jannah, we can either go through this world with trials and tribulations, where actually in a hadith, Rasulullah mentioned, for us on the Day of Judgment, if we were to see the people who bear patiently we would have sliced our skin for the reward. Seeing all the reward, the people who bear patiently for all their trials and tribulations, we would want to slice our skin out of envy, out of seeing the amount of reward they get. Right? So this dunya in itself is actually a purification process. And if this dunya cannot purify us, then it will be in the punishment of the grave. Right? That's another purification process. But actually before that, even scholars speak of the pain one experience during the moment of passing away, during death, is in itself also a purification process. And all those, if it doesn't, then it will lead to punishment of the grave. And out of all those years of punishment in the grave, if it isn't enough to purify all your mistakes, then it will be in hellfire. Until, and out of Allah's knowledge, out of His wisdom, until the moment He thinks you are purified, subhanahu wa ta'ala, will you then be free from it. And so as believers, we can't risk. We can't risk spending any moments in hellfire. Though we don't really have time to cover the concept of hellfire here, but I would advise you to actually make it an effort to learn about it. Because that's actually essentially the knowledge that made me start praying. Yeah, please.
I was thinking, like, will our sincerity be questioned because we're doing good things and we're avoiding bad things just for a reward? So will even people question our sincerity because we're just expecting a reward and doing things and avoiding things? So what about the people who does not have this mentality, the reward mentality, but they do things, they would say they're sincere, but our Muslims are less sincere because we're expecting a reward. So what do you, like, any comments on that?
So you mean people of other faith?
Yeah, like other people, they might not have this reward system mentality, but they said they're doing it out of love for the other person. So how about, like, we are doing things out of a reward system mentality? So would that be, in their eyes, would it also be worse? Or even in the mentality, like, are we really sincere? Yeah, that's.
I get your question. Yeah. So basically, this is a question I actually received from quite a number of non-Muslims too, where they mentioned that they're doing certain acts of charity sincerely for that individual, right? Of course, we are in no place to question their sincerity for others, but then as human beings, we have different reward system, right? They can actually be convincing themselves, or how should I put it? I would like to see it as more of every one of us has different motivation, right? It could be motivated by the desire, because when you think about it, helping others or wanting to help others, isn't it in itself a desire that you want to fulfill, right? So in terms of sincerity, we're actually wanting to fulfill that desire of wanting to help others. Because sometimes when we help others, it feels good, or it just fills up that void in us of serving others, right? So every one of us, to some extent, no matter how sincere they claim, there's that desire of theirs that will in some way or another be fulfilled, right? So I would say every one of us have different motivation, and with different motivation, only the motivation for the hereafter that can ever be sincere. Because whatever you are getting in reward is never in this world. Right? When you think about it, there's this concept of delayed gratification in psychology, where they mentioned those who perform better usually have a better ability to delay gratifying themselves. Right? When you think about it, aren't we Muslims delaying our reward Not 2 years after, not 5 years, not after we're married, not after we have kids, not after we retire, but after we die, right? What greater sincerity for that moment we're doing it for? Right, that's how I see. I'm not sure am I answering your questions.
I think so. The best sincerity would be just for the sake of Allah. So that I think that's the reason why we do everything for the sake of Allah, because there's no real definition of sincerity.
Exactly. Sincerity in itself is actually a concept where it's. I mean, from their philosophical perspective, it's actually a debatable term, right? And I remember I was talking with a brother where he mentioned that the philosophers in the past would actually question the definition of sincerity. Right? How do you define a sincerity that's sincere? Right? Or how it can be seen as sincere. Right? So all those philosophical discussion are pretty prevalent in the non-Muslim community because they themselves don't know what is sincerity. And for us believers, the ultimate, most sincere perspective or way of life we can have is for Allah and Allah alone. Right? And anything else?
That's it. Battery died.
The phone?
No, yeah.
Subhanallah.
Subhanakallah.
Subhanallah.
I was thinking, do we still have time?
Yeah, we do.
Yeah, I was thinking because there's 7 different levels of heaven, and each person will get anything they desire.
Mm.
So, what's the difference between the 7 different levels of heaven?
Oh, no. Oh, yeah, this is a good question. So basically, the 7 different heavens I mentioned about is different from Jannah. So it's different from Jannah. Scholars actually clarified on this issue, where basically the 7 different heavens, those are actually surrounding the Ard, the lowest heaven, and the lowest earth, basically. The dunya, basically. The entire 7 heavens is considered the dunya, right? And anything that's outside of it, of course Allah knows best, but then is paradise and hellfire, right? And yeah, so basically it's not to be mixed up with Jannah, right? When we talk about
So there's no like 7 different Jannah.
so in terms of levels of paradise, scholars actually mention the minimum in paradise, the level of paradise, is 100. And in an authentic narration where Rasulullah mentioned that paradise is of 100 levels, right? But scholars consider it to be minimum. And I'm not sure why though, but yeah, there are scholarly opinion there available in terms of that entire or the actual number of paradise is not known to us, right? There could be more, most likely. Okay. Subhanakallah wa bihamdik. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
The one, the one, the one, the one.